Well, hello everyone. First thing I want to say is I can see all of your haircuts and they look fabulous. It doesn't seem right to begin this webinar without referencing the extraordinary situation that we all find ourselves in. Here we are, quarantining ourselves, working at home, sheltering in place, to use that old Cold War term. Every day I cycle back and forth between gloom and doom at the national and international news, and able to find moments of grace in the day that are unexpected, because I'm in an unexpected situation with two teenagers that would normally be, away at school, and now they're here living with us, and so we find happy moments and moments of closeness where we can. It's been a good time, though, to be a history teacher, don't you think? I've been talking with students and with other faculty, too, about the 1918 pandemic and what we can learn from that experience, about the various waves of polio that scared Americans across the 20th century, about HIV and AIDS, and I don't know, also about toilet paper. My slide is stuck. I wonder if, Robert, you could help me advance this slide. I'm not sure what happened. You knew it was working earlier.
Try sharing it again, and let's see if that'll sort of kickstart it.
Stop share. Go back to this. Let's see. Just hate it when you do dry run after dry run and everything's fine, and then it comes time for the show and it doesn't work.
Make sure you are on the PowerPoint, the presentation, when you click.
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Oh, now it's working. Talking about toilet paper. Everything has a history, right? Even toilet paper. And if you're as old as I am, you know at least this way to hide TB from the masses who are hoarding it away from the rest of us. What if I told you that I've never done a webinar before? And in fact, I've never even seen a webinar until this month. I looked at Trini Gonzalez's webinar from his presentation, loved his idea of the testimonial, and I'm going to use some of that today. Then yesterday, I went and watched a video, a webinar on how to cook barbecue baby back ribs. We had snow a week ago today, 6 inches of snow, but it was gorgeous on Saturday, so I pulled the cover off the smoker and thought I'd brush up with a webinar on how to make barbecued ribs. What I noticed about that webinar is the Meathead Goldwyn, who is kind of like the Neil Tyson deGrasse of barbecue experts. He must have an education background, because he started the webinar. The very first thing he said was, by the end of this webinar, you will be able to smoke the most delicious baby back ribs you have ever tasted. And well, you can see for yourself, they did turn out pretty good. And in fact, everybody at the table that night said, yeah, these are about the best ribs you've ever made, Lendol. So it worked out. So I'll take a cue from Meathead Goldwyn now and just start this webinar by telling you, by the end of this webinar, you will be able to teach the best history course that you have ever taught in your entire life. Okay, that doesn't sound plausible, does it? In fact, teaching history is a lot more complicated than smoking baby back ribs. So I'm going to break what is apparently the first rule of webinars and dial back expectations here for what we can accomplish in 45 minutes. By the end of this webinar, I think you should be able to know one other history professor's story about how he came to believe it's a good idea to replace some coverage of historical material in an introductory course and replace it with uncoverage, or the demystification of thinking habits that are crucial to how historians make sense of the past. And by the end of this webinar, I think you'll have some ideas for how to turn history in an intro class from a noun into a verb. These ideas will be like little potted plants you pick up this time of the year at the garden center. They'll be starter ideas that you can later grow as you work and experiment with them and listen to more webinars. So that's what we're going to be about. Did you see the movie The Martian? It was a 2015 science fiction movie directed by Ridley Scott and starring Matt Damon. It's set near future. Astronauts are on Mars, and when it's time to return to Earth, the astronauts blast off from the planet, but they accidentally, unknowingly leave behind Mark Watney, played by Damon. He's presumed, as far as they know, after a fierce storm on the planet. With only a meager amount of supplies, the stranded astronaut now has to utilize his wits and keep up his spirits to find a way to survive on this hostile planet. And one scene in this movie in particular seemed to delight audiences.
In the face of overwhelming odds, I'm left with only one option. I'm gonna have to science the shit out of this.
Science the shit out of this. When I saw that scene in the movie, I thought, you know, if science can be a verb, why can't history be a verb too? So I want to share with you today some of my ideas for how you can turn history from a noun in your introductory classes into a verb so that students history the shit out of things. I've got 3 parts to the webinar. In the first part, I'll just tell you how I came by class that I'm going to describe to you eventually. What's my story? In the second part, I want to answer a question that I'm always asking when I go to presentations and professional development. What's this new crap? What's wrong with the old crap? And in the largest part of the webinar, the longest part, I'd like to answer the question, what does Uncoverage look like? What can it look like in an introductory course? I don't know about you, but coming through graduate school in the 1980s, I didn't learn very much about teaching. In fact, I think it's fair to say that as far as teaching goes, I and people my generation were pretty much raised by wolves. When I got my first teaching job, a 1-year position at the University of Washington, I went to my advisor at the University of Chicago, and I asked her what I needed to do to get ready to teach. I was a little scared, to be honest. I knew that in the fall term I'd be teaching the U.S. History Survey. I knew it'd be a big class, and I never taught that one like that before. And I was scared. And one of the members of my committee gave me some of the worst advice that it's possible to give a new teacher just starting out. She said, Lendol, don't worry about it. Just tell them what you know. Tell them what you know. Well, the problem with that kind of advice is that it primed me to teach a course that we might call a MOOP. You've heard of MOOCs, I think. Massive online courses. Well, a MOOP is a little different from that. MOOP stands for Massively Obsolete Ordinary Operating Procedures. That's what I went out to the University of Washington and taught. With 10 days to go before the first day of class, I sat down with a legal pad and a piece of paper and scribbling notes. The first thing I needed to do was get a textbook and get it fast so that I could get it to the bookstore. I had the textbook I wanted there before me, so I opened it up to its table of contents and used the table of contents to draft out a syllabus. Then I started drafting lecture topics that I spread across the 10 weeks of the term. Back in those days, this was long before PowerPoint, but I did have an overhead projector in this large lecture, so I gave some thought to what kind of visuals I could put on an overhead. And at least in that first sit down, I didn't even think about exam. Last thing on my mind. D. Fink has accurately, I think, labeled this kind of course planning instructor-centered. And he says it's a pretty common way for new professors to sit down and write out a course. Well, I did one other thing too. After I'd picked a textbook for the students, I ordered another textbook, a little more advanced one, for myself. And that would become basically the, the resources for the notes in my lectures. I was always really embarrassed about what I did that first time I taught, until I read in D. Fink's book on course design. Lots of people do this. And one time I was on a panel at an AHA event with Kevin Gannon, that you might know him as the tattooed professor. I confided to Kevin that, yeah, I had given the students one textbook and then ordered another for myself. And he said, I did that too. And he said, why don't you ask for a show of hands today in the meeting for how many people have actually done that? And when I asked for a show of hands, how many people had done that, over half the people in the room sheepishly raised their hands. This kind of MOOP course later came to describe as a coverage-oriented introductory course. The goal of the course is to present history to students as a noun, as a subject, as other people's knowledge that's been produced, vetted over time, and labeled important by me, the instructor. The method of the coverage course is to follow the table of contents of the experts who have certified what stands for knowledge in history. I didn't have a big question that my course was set up to answer, but there was an unstated or implicit question, and that question was, what does Dr. Calder say? What does Dr. Calder say is important to know? And what are Dr. Calder's thoughts about those subjects? Assessment in the coverage-oriented course involves repeating back what the professor and the textbooks had to say about various subjects. And the pedagogical assumption behind this way of teaching has been called the attic theory of cognition, which imagines the human brain as something like a big attic where you can store bits of information to be used later, years later even, when you pull those things down from your attic mind. The assumption was state of the art about 80 years ago, but has and no cognitive psychologist has believed in it for over 50 years, and yet there I was in 1993 at the University of Washington, building an entire course on that assumption. This postcard from France in 1910, we're imagining a teaching machine that could be used to perfectly teach the young by the year 2000. And it might as well be a photograph of me standing in Smith Hall in 1993 with my textbooks and secondary source readings ready to transfer what I knew and what the textbooks knew into the minds of the 220 students sitting in Smith Hall. Things went fine the first term, fall term. I stayed up all night, every night it seemed, writing my lecture. Next day, it was very hard on me to get all those lectures written. I had three goals as a professor. The first goal was to be responsible to history. I had this, what seems to me now, an odd feeling that if I didn't say something happened in the past, then in the minds of the students, it wouldn't have happened. And so I felt a responsibility to history to cover a tremendous amount of it. A second goal I had was to be funny. I knew I wanted to be a good teacher. Funny could help students stay awake so that they could do stuff. And I wanted to be wise, which at my age was probably impossible for the time, but it was one of my goals. So I was working hard. I wanted to be a good teacher. The term ended without any incidents. I got my course evaluations back, and I guess I did okay. You know, on the 10-point scale that we were rated on several categories, I got above 9 in every category. Geez, it made that lasted because in the spring term, I got my comeuppance. It came in a unit on the civil rights movement. And this was a subject close to my heart, so I worked extra hard in crafting some really good lectures. And one morning there in Smith Hall, as I stood on the stage, telling students about what Martin Luther King and the others had done in Selma in 1965, I reached the crescendo moment of the lecture, which I had laid out on Aristotelian principles of narrative. As I came to the dynamic moment of the lecture, something happened to me that has never happened again. I actually teared up at the point I was making in my own lecture. And I had to stop to compose myself. As I wiped a tear from my eye, I suddenly thought I heard people laughing somewhere out there in the lecture hall. Could it be people were laughing at me crying? At King walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the way to the state capitol? What? Are you kidding me? I came to and began looking for the source of this laughter, which was now becoming more general and louder. And a young woman in the first row pointed over her shoulder, and I followed her direction. And there I saw a couple of sheepish looking students holding some photographs, caught in the act of passing around some photographs from a fraternity party a couple of days before. These were girls gone wild type photographs. You know what I'm talking about. And that's what about a third of the students in the room now were laughing at as they passed them around. Yeah. While I was marching with King and Lewis and Hamer and the others at Selma, the students in the lecture hall were at a fraternity party having the time of their lives. What would you have done in that moment? Well, this is what I did. I folded up my notes And I walked out of the room and I didn't come back. In mid-sentence, I left the lecture and did not return that day. That's quite possibly the most hurtful moment in my career as a history teacher. It stung. It stung a lot. But that moment made it possible for me eventually to realize something very important. It helped me to realize that most of the time when I'm up on stage talking, what I'm talking about and what students are hearing are two very different things. I might be talking about an advanced state-of-the-art racing motorcycle, but what students are visualizing in their head looks something more like a basic child's tricycle. I came to call this kind of moments Spinoza moments after an incident that happened at Woodrow Wilson's institution, Princeton, in the 1920s. A young student had been brought up on charges that he was laughing at his professors. The professor was lecturing in a history class and the student was laughing out loud, and so the professor complained and sent him to the dean to be disciplined. And the dean said to the student, "Look here, we can't have students laughing at our professors." And the student said, "I can't help it. He's so funny. He's just so funny." And the dean said, "I assure you, your professor doesn't mean to be funny. What does he say that's so amusing to you?" And the student said, "Funny words like Spinoza." That's Spinoza. Yeah. When teachers are saying A, B, C, there's no telling what students are actually hearing in those Spinoza moments, as I now think of them. The moment was hurtful that day in Smith Hall, but it enabled me to learn the truth of what one of my favorite teaching pedagogues said once to a reporter. Red Auerbach, when asked what the secret to his coaching success was, he said, "It's not what you say, it's what they hear." It's not what you say, it's what they hear. I left the classroom that day and went down the hall and drowned my sorrows in the company of another colleague on the faculty. She heard me out. She let me vent my spleen, my rage at the students' cluelessness and rudeness. And then when I'd had my say, she gave me some of the best teaching advice I've ever heard in my entire life. She said, "Lendol, you're going to need to learn to love your students." So that's an important part of my story. That day when the professor in me died in Smith Hall at the University of Washington, and a teacher was born. It took me a while to know what it meant to love my students, but the key part of it was in what my colleague said to me. She said, "You need to learn to love your students. Learn to love your students." The way I learned to love history in graduate school was by reading scholarly works. And what worked in graduate school worked for me as a young teacher too. I set out to get my hands on everything I could read about how to teach well. And I'll just say that three of the most important teachers for me were, first, Peter Fredericks, who you see here on screen, who was just about the only historian writing about teaching in the early 1990s when I was a young professor. I found some of his articles in HA Perspectives and immediately began putting his advice into action in my classrooms. Now, Peter Fredericks was an early adopter of what was called active learning. And so for a few years, I was really into active learning. I don't know if it made my classroom a better place for students, but it got the ball rolling for me and helped me rethink how to teach, especially introductory history courses. And I began walking to class not thinking, what am I going to say today, like I did at the University of Washington, but what am I going to do today with students to help them learn? That was an important move for me. The second person who was important to me was Grant Wiggins, a course design theorist, the guru, really, of course design in our time, and unfortunately recently deceased. Grant Wiggins taught me about backwards design, and I think most of us are familiar with that concept. And he also gave me the idea of, or the concepts of coverage and uncoverage. I'm happy to credit Grant Wiggins for just about everything I learned about uncoverage. The idea wasn't new to him, though, or original to him. It goes all the way back to learning theorists of the 1930s. And then finally, the third person who was important in my development as a history teacher was Sam Weinberg. Before I met Sam, I guess I agreed with John Lukács, I think it was, who said the only historical method is knowing how to read. Nobody had taught me what it meant to think historically, either as an undergraduate or didactically as a graduate student. So I didn't know anything about historical thinking in a conscious way. I'd internalized it in graduate school without knowing what I'd become good at. Sam, of course, using empirical methods taken from cognitive science, was busy in the late 80s and early 90s understanding what it was that made how historians think different from how other people think. And it was from Sam that I first began to recognize what I was doing as a historian in my own writing. Things like sourcing, contextualizing, and corroborating information. Peter Fredericks, Grant Wiggins, and Sam Weinberg are people upon whose shoulders I stand today, and the ideas that I have to share with you pretty much in one way or another all trace back to them. Now, what's this new uncoverage crap? I hope people are thinking. What's wrong with the old crap? It's very hard to remember what it's like to learn something that you don't know much about. But I think I can demonstrate it with this brilliant example that has been attributed to a teacher named Judy Lemire. Imagine being in class and I am lecturing to you about Traxylene. Class, it's very important that you learn about Traxylene. Traxylene is a new form of zeonter. It is montilled in serostana. The serostanians gristolate large amounts of fevron and then bracter it to quasel Traxylene. Class, Traxylene is important because of our zeonter lasigae. All right, it's time to take a test. Class, what is Traxylene? You can repeat after me. Traxylene, it's a new form of zeonter. Where is Traxylene montilled, class? Well, the Cistercianians gristolate it. Why is Traxylene important? Because of our zeonter lasigae. This is what's wrong with the coverage approaches to history or any other subject. Students can reproduce the coverage information without understanding anything they're talking about. And eventually, all this talk about Traxylene becomes exceedingly boring. This problem with coverage has been brilliantly parodied in movies like Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, the Great Depression, passed the, the tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which raised or lowered, raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
So the problem parodied there in the movie is obviously one of boredom, which must be an old problem because we find evidence for it in the gargoyles in the most ancient colleges at Oxford and Cambridge. Another big problem with this coverage approach is it doesn't work. Nearly a century of coverage-oriented history teaching hasn't given Americans an adult understanding of American or world history or any kind of history. The real problems go deeper than either of these. I used to begin my introductory courses with an exercise that asked students to tell me what they think history is. About 75 to 80% of the students would turn in a response like this one that you see here. History is the story of the past, the student writes. Historians gather the facts and the ideas that were going on during important periods of our past, and they write it down so future generations can learn about it. Like you, I was chagrined to see a student with this inadequate view of what history is. The story of the past, just a single story? We call this a misconception about history, but it's really not a misconception. This student learned from a coverage-oriented history course exactly what the pedagogy wanted the student to learn. When all you have is a textbook, when all you have is an instructor covering massive amounts of information, of course a student's going to believe that history is essentially the story of the past, the textbook story, the teacher's story, the one best story that historians agree on. So coverage teaches deep misconceptions about what history is. And then an even more disturbing problem has come to light in the last 5 years and given us the purpose for the entire Gateways project. It turns out that coverage-oriented teaching impacts some students more than others and deprives some students of equitable results more than others. And those would be students who are first in their families to go to college, or students who have come from schools that didn't adequately prepare them for higher education. So that's what's wrong with the coverage approach. I set out in the mid-1990s to try to come up with a new kind of course that would be based on something R.G. Collingwood once said, that nothing capable of being memorized is history. A course that wouldn't even have exams like I had at the University of Washington. In the beginning, I didn't know what I was doing. It took me about 10 or 12 years to finally get a course that I was happy with. If I had done it according to the way you're supposed to do it, I would have followed a process of backwards design where I formulate broad learning goals, then design assessments to tell me whether my students were meeting those goals, and then finally develop learning activities that would get them ready to take the assessments. That's not actually how I designed my course, though, because I was flying in the dark. When I first started coming up with ideas for Uncoverage, I had not yet read anything by Grant Wiggins or other theorists of backwards design. But I'm going to pretend that I did and organize the rest of this webinar on the principles of backwards design. The first thing we need to figure out when we want to teach our students is, what do they need to know? What do they need to do, and what do they need to love? I like these 3 circles from Grant Wiggins's Understanding by Design workshops. There's some things that are worth being familiar with. historical subjects, for example, like in my introductory course, I would like students to know what Watergate was or what decade World War I was fought in, and that's probably enough. But then there are other things that are important to know and to do. And so I'm going to spend more time with students on those kind of historical heuristics or mental shortcuts. And then there are things that are worth enduring understanding, things that you want your students to remember 15 years later and to be practicing in their lives. In my Uncoverage-oriented intro course, the enduring understandings and the heuristics that I've come up with look like this. I want students, after they've taken my course, to be able to history the shit out of things by learning these 5 historical thinking heuristics. How to ask a good question, a good historical question. How to look for connections between things so that they can corroborate doubtful information and contextualize sources of information to moments in time. I want them to know how to source information, to assess whether the degree of credibility that that information has and what kind of questions it's good for answering. I'd like them to know how to create knowledge by a process of argument, using evidence, and disciplining themselves to consider different perspectives before settling on any single one, and recognizing that there are limits to what we can know when we're studying the past. And finally, and this is a pretty recent addition in my course, I want students to have some skill at narrativity, at being able to recognize a story when they see it, and especially a bad story. These 5 heuristics are what I think is worth enduring understanding in my course. Now, I have to caution us. No student, or very few students, sign up for an introductory history course to learn how to think like a historian. They just don't. So you can't come at them straight ways. You got to come at this sideways. And the way I do that is by using Grant Wiggins' concept of the essential question. Good courses are built on essential questions that have no obvious right answer, and so invite debate and continued scrutiny. And they lead to other questions. They're generative. They should address the conceptual foundations of a discipline, and so that you need to uncover those foundations and teach them, because they are not actually natural to people. The essential question should naturally reoccur day by day, week by week, and occurs. And they should be interesting to students, either on the face of it, or you should be able to make them interesting. The essential questions that I've come up with for my introductory American history course are these. The big question is, what's the story of American history? And the course will introduce students to a number of different interpretations of the American past and invite them to consider which one of them they think is the most plausible. The second question in the course is, when historians make sense of the past, how do they distinguish between a plausible interpretation and an implausible or even stupid story about the past? That's an important question. And then thirdly, I want my course to answer this question for students. How can historical thinking help me? How will it help me as a human being, as a citizen, and as a leader going forward in my work and life? These are the framing questions for every meeting in my course, and for every assignment, and for every assessment. Now, speaking of assessments, you've got to answer the question, how will I know what my students know? How will I know what they can do, and how will I know what they can value? I've gone to a gaming approach that I learned from Stephen Mentz a couple of years ago. Stephen Mentz is at the University of Texas and teaches very large 500 student introductory courses. When you gamify a course, you have a number of assessments that students can pick and choose from on their way to a final goal of points. The numbers here are large because big numbers are more fun than small numbers, gaming theorists tell us. I'm not a gamer myself, so I have to take all of this on a bit of faith. My introductory course has one high stakes assessment. And you see it here, I very creatively call it the final assignment. The final assignment in this course is worth 2,000 points out of a total number of 11,700 points. So the final assignment is 17% of a student's grade. That's a pretty high stakes assignment. I'll show it to you and then come back and we'll look at the small stakes assignments. The high stakes assignment asks students at the end of the course to imagine they work for the National Council of History Education. We read two histories in my introductory American history course, one written by Jill Lepore and the other by Howard Zinn. And so the final assignment has students imagining that the Board of Trustees for the NCHE wants them to recommend that one of these books is a better history over the other. And then the NCHE is going to mail a copy of that book to every single adult American for a series of conversations, a la Oprah's book club, to be held throughout the summer. It's a kind of real world, authentic assessment that one could almost imagine happening in a better society than ours. And it will call upon students to demonstrate what they know, what they can do, and what they value, things that I've been teaching all throughout the course. Other than that, all the other assignments are small stakes assignments. They take quizzes. They watch films and complete film guides. They do exercises in and outside of class. I have what I call history gym workouts that teach them the history thinking heuristics emphasized in the course. They find examples of the heuristics in the two historians that we're reading, Lepore and Zinn, and they show those to me for points. And there are other miscellaneous exercises that we do as well. Students can also choose from bonus activities. They can write what I call point paragraphs. They can write extra essays. They can make videos. They can impress me in class by catching me saying something that isn't true. All of this allows them to come up with different ways to show me what they know, what they're capable of doing, and what they value. The points are cataloged in an online Google Doc. Students take gamer names so that nobody knows whose points these belong to. And over the course of a term, the points accumulate. And eventually, the points translate into a grade in the course, as you see here under levels and grades. What about learning experiences? What kind of experiences do I plan for students in an Uncoverage course that get them ready to do these activities and assessments? Well, here's a copy of the first 3 weeks of the course on the syllabus. You'll notice right away, my course starts differently than most people's history courses. We don't begin an examination of a historical topic, in this case, Reconstruction, until week 3. The first 2 weeks of the course are spent in a unit called History Uncovered. I call this first 2 weeks the overture to my course, and I recommend this for all history courses. A beginning overture, the purpose of which is to uncover students' misconceptions about what history is and to begin to replace those misconceptions with a better idea of the nature of historical knowledge. You see, if you don't start this way, if you just jump into an examination of historical topics, you're liable to get this kind of feedback on course evaluations at the end of the term. From years ago, I got a student who said, the professor needs to understand this is a history class, not a writing class. I bet a lot of you have emphasized writing in your courses have gotten feedback like that. Or what about this? This was a frustrating class. It expected a lot. Why can't he just tell us the answers? I mean, you know, like that the professor's paid to tell me the answer, right? And this is my personal favorite. I felt like this wasn't really a history class. It was almost like philosophy. He emphasized thinking a lot. Yeah, well, of course the student's going to think that way if they have the standard misconception of what history is in their mind, that it's a noun and not a verb, that it's knowing stuff about subjects and not being able to make sense of the past using heuristics and habits of mind that are common to historians. So I begin with an overture. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 class periods. And that number is not important. I've used 3 class periods. I've used 4. I'm presently using 5. And here's what happens. On the first day of the course, I don't even preview the syllabus on the first day of course. I instead just immediately jump into doing history so that students get a sense of what the course will be like, and they can drop it if they need to. I show them pictures taken from the history of my particular institution, Augustana College. Pictures like this. And I put them in groups and I ask them to make sense of what they see. And at first they can't do it. But eventually, even in just a 50-minute class period, I could teach them how to use skills of historical narrativity to make sense of a picture. They have to decide who the main character is. They have to isolate a setting. They have to identify some key action that's taking place. They have to look for some kind of obstacle that sets up a dramatic moment in this story. They have to look for some technique that the main character uses to overcome the obstacle or the enemy. And by the end of the very first class period, students are able to tell a story that makes sense of some artifact from the past, like a historical photograph. I end that first day of class with this image. It becomes an iconic image in my introductory course. I tell students, look, what is this? If you don't know what it is, that's because all problems in the beginning are nonsensical and hard to figure out. What we're going to do in this history course is learn how to history the shit out of stuff that doesn't make sense. I'm going to teach you historical heuristics that will help you find patterns in the information that comes at you. Patterns that will help you make sense of the past and of everyday life all around you. That's the first day of class. I send students off to watch a video clip from Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing. It's a video clip towards the end of the movie when a moment of terrible violence breaks out in Brooklyn, New York City, as a pizza parlor owned by a white man is burned to the ground by the residents of this neighborhood who are African American. It's a 20-minute long clip. Students watch it. Students watch it and do this assignment, which they bring to the second day of class. I asked them to tell me what happened at Sal's Pizzeria. And now they draw on what we did the first day to make a story about what they saw in the 20-minute clip. They have to answer these questions. You know, what happened? When did it happen? What year was this? Where did it happen? Using clues in the video. Who are the main characters? What obstacle did they face? And how did they overcome it? And finally, what did this all mean? They bring a one-page story about what they saw happen at Sal's to class. On that Friday, the topic is problems of historical knowledge. And this activity will uncover for students the nature of historical knowledge and what the problems are with our particular kind of knowledge. As we debate their stories in class, because no two students write the same story, it begins to sink in on everybody what the point of the exercise was. William Graham Sumner was a sociologist, but of history, he said, every student during his academic period ought to get up one bit of history thoroughly from the ultimate sources in order to convince himself what history is not. It's not certain. It's not something we all are going to agree on. It's not the one best authoritative narrative. That's not the nature of our knowledge. Our knowledge is going to be something more like an argument, often. An argument that goes on, the bigger the questions become. On that second day of class, I helped students take notes by putting up my notes on the board for them to follow along. And I quit doing that about week 3. Here's what we're learning from this uncoverage exercise based on do the right thing. History is not objective. It can't be. Students learn 3 reasons why it can't be. And by the end of the class period, we learned students have used the exercise to deduce that objective knowledge has problems, and then relativity has problems too. If you say nothing can be known. In fact, we did know some things about that do the right thing moment in time. We were able to decide it happened in 1992, and that it happened in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. Some things it is possible to come to consensus on, but not all things. We couldn't agree on why Mookie throws the garbage can through the window and starts the riot. We can't agree on whether to call it a riot or a rebellion. And so in that setting, we learned that historical knowledge has limits, and we're going to temper our convictions with humility. For the third class in the overture, I send students home for another activity, this time to write a 1-page history of the United States, which is the topic of our course. They have to write this 1-page history out of their heads. I don't allow them to look anything up. They bring this history to class on Monday, where our topic now is, what is the story of America? In class, we use their stories to learn that, first of all, everybody, when they look at the past, has some sense of pattern that they impose on the past. Looking at this picture, students tell me what they see. Everybody at first says they see a mountain lake. I say, look harder. And eventually, other students begin to see different things. They see a mother and a child. They might be praying. Another student sees a turtle turning his head. This is historical knowledge, I say. People in the past have imposed various patterns on the past. Sometimes linearity, sometimes chaos, sometimes cycles. Obviously, my debriefing is much longer than I have time for here, but you get the idea. Then we look at their stories, and I have students read somebody else's story and tell me, what pattern does this story manifest? Is it a linear history? Does it show a one damn thing after another chaos sort of pattern where nothing matters or makes sense? Or is it a cyclical pattern that this person has imposed in their understanding of the past? We proceed from there then to identify more discrete stories or plots that make sense of American history. I don't claim that these are the only stories, but they work well enough for our purposes. And in our course, we're going to read 2 historians who tell different stories. Howard Zinn follows a plot that could be summarized as the people versus the elites. And Jill Lepore follows a story, or tells a story that follows a plot that I call high ideals but mixed results. Reading these 2 histories for the rest of the term, students internalize the nature of history, that it's an argument, not a one best authoritative narrative that we all agree on. What is the story of America? Using Ta-Nehisi Coates, Michelle Obama, Howard Zinn. This past term, using Howard Trump's speech in January, students come to be able to recognize stories when they see them being told around them. That's my overture. The rest of the course uncovers history by following a recurring pattern of meetings through various units or modules. We're looking here at a module I have on America in the 1950s. You'll see we meet 3 times for that topic. We have a history workshop 1 where we meet to debrief a film that students watched on their own. And in this history workshop 1, I introduce a new historical thinking heuristic. Then students go home, they perform an exercise called History Gym, where they do the sourcing heuristic this week as applied to primary documents. I'm writing a book called Uncovering the Story of American History, and students are using draft chapters from that book, which is going to be published by Oxford University Press in about a year's time. That was a little commercial I just snuck in here. Trevor Gatz and I are cooperating on a project where Trevor's doing the world history side of things, and I'm in charge of the American history side. Then in the 3rd day of the unit, we meet to consider our 2 historians, Lepore and Zen. So different kinds of inquiry are happening here. From visual inquiry, where students learn how to watch moving images with a critical analysis, to critical inquiry, where they learn the 5 historical heuristics I teach in the introductory course: questioning, connecting, sourcing, arguing, and storytelling. I roll these out one at a time, week by week, until towards the end of the course, students are able to perform all 5 heuristics together on the assignments that they do. I weave into my course now stories of actual people out in the world using these heuristics to help them be better human beings and citizens and leaders in the world of work. When we meet for that 2nd workshop, I use various activities such as the history assessments of thinking developed by Sam Weinberg and his colleagues at the Stanford History Education Group. I'm going to swiftly run through these slides because we won't have time to focus on them. These history gym assignments ask students to do a workout where they history the shit out of something using the heuristics of the course. This particular workout focuses on sourcing, as students have to bring to class various levels of skill at sourcing, from being absolute nincompoops at it, to sort of slightly getting it, to showing a proficient demonstration of sourcing as applied to a historical source of information. And then in our last day of the unit, we consider our 2 historians. Okay, I need to wrap up here. You can see that the Uncoverage introductory course looks a lot different from the Coverage course. For one thing, when people walk in and watch, the first thing they say is usually, man, your students just look so busy, because they're doing things, not sitting and listening and cogitating quietly to themselves. That doing seems to be the key thing that makes this work. I'm walking to class now thinking, what are they going to do today? What's our enduring question for this class meeting? What kind of introduction can I build that will warrant the question and make it meaningful to students? What activities will we do in class today so that students can get practice at what they're learning and that I can use as a formative assessment in case we need more teaching? What misconceptions do I need to address here that are bound to come up? And how will I know that they're learning anything? Is this kind of thing working? We recently in our department assessed the sourcing heuristic among our students. And I had 54 students take a history assessment of thinking tests that concerned sourcing. These students had taken my introductory history course the previous term. We tracked them down, gave them the history assessment of thinking, and 21% rated as proficient. Another 20% were emergent and 59% were basic. That's not a good result. I'm not happy with it. But when Sam and his colleagues gave this very same sourcing hat to students who were in a coverage course at a University of California State System school, those were the results from that course, which had 78 students in it. Only 2 students in the course rated as proficient. So uncoverage doesn't make learning easier, or it doesn't wave a magic wand and make all students little historians, but it does work better than the old coverage approach at teaching students how to think. All right, with that, I'm going to quit. And Stephanie and Rob, I will flip it back to you.
Thank you so much, Lendol. We do have one question from Janine Drake. I don't know if you can see the question in the Q&A area. And I wondered if that was one that you might be able to answer pretty quickly.
Could you read it for me?
I would be very happy to. She said, I found that the overture has less meaning until after we've looked at a bunch of history. Have you tried this overture at the end of the semester or in the middle? And do you find that students respond differently to your U.S. survey if they have had U.S. history in high school compared to those who have not?
No, I've never tried your idea. It'd be interesting to do a side-by-side comparison. And if you want to try that out, please do, and let me know what happens. The second part of that question was, do students who had U.S. history perform any differently than students who didn't?
Right.
Well, pretty much where this shows up would be with international students who may not have had U.S. history. In the case of Augustana, our international students actually know more U.S. history on average than the American students know. So yeah, I have found a difference, but it's not going the way you might expect.
I've actually observed similar when I was teaching a global challenges class. I was surprised at first to see my international students had much better understanding and knowledge of our own history in this country compared to my native U.S. students. There are a couple more questions, Lendol, if we can hang on for a few more minutes. Next question has to do with books and authors that you would recommend.
I think
that
the 2 books to read are D. Fink's Creating Significant Learning Experiences. This is Grant Wiggins' book, Understanding by Design, translated for college professors. Grant Wiggins was a K-12 specialist. I think Grant's book is better, actually, and I'm friends with Dee, so I can say that. I just love Grant Wiggins' stuff. But college professors sometimes objected to the K-12 examples in that book, and Dee Fink did us all a service in making the translation required so that college professors would read a book on course design. And the second book is a wonderful book put out by Nancy Chick and her colleagues in the University of Wisconsin system, Exploring Signature Pedagogies. There's a chapter in there on history that's top shelf example scholarship of teaching and learning when it comes to history, and it has a focus on introductory courses.
Excellent. And Nancy Chick is a fantastic and prolific scholar in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So there's a lot to be learned from her. There are a couple more questions. One about the approach working in an online class format. I
guess I'm learning about that as we speak. Although I wouldn't call what I'm doing online learning. It's scrambling to keep up with remote learning. I find, though, that it's translated very well, except in one respect. It's way more work online than I find it to be in face-to-face. So that is my project for this summer. I expect to be teaching online in the fall. I don't know about you guys, but that's just my sense of where things are going. I got to figure out some way to make this workload manageable remote online. For some reason online, I'm giving way more feedback to students than I ever did face-to-face, and it's killing me.
I think that many of us are struggling with the same, and I can say quickly that we will be working on some resources and webinars, maybe some asynchronous learning opportunities through the Gardner Institute and the American Historical Association to help faculty navigate these uncharted waters and learn more about online teaching and learning, and how to make that workload a little bit more manageable will certainly be on the list of topics. We had another question about remote teaching. So how is this methodology working in remote teaching? What about this methodology works well for our current online setup? And what about this methodology needs to be tweaked?
Giving students a choice of activities to do and accumulating points towards their final grade, that works really well online, I'm finding. I'm not doing any synchronous teaching this spring. I just felt like the technology wasn't ready for that yet. So I told students we're going to dig into the oldest technology in history teaching and learning, which is the book. It's an amazing technology. The students are at their own pace, reading our books, and then doing the things with those books that we had done face to face, learning how to find the main points, looking for the heuristics in the pages of the books and showing the examples, finding out that just because you're a published historian doesn't mean you always do the heuristic right.
Lendol, there are a couple more questions from Nancy, though. Nancy Young, she said that she's doing something fairly similar in her online class and would be happy to discuss with whomever has a question. So putting that out there.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yes, thank you. Dan McInerney has a question for you. What does a quiz look like in an Uncoverage class?
They're quick and easy. What I'm trying to teach students to do is find the main point, the big claim in an author's writing. So the quiz has two questions. What was the main point for Howard Zinn today? What was the main point for Jill Laporte today? They're multiple choice. I give them 4 versions of the main claim in the chapter, and they have to recognize which one was the author's art, the big claim. They're terrible at this at first. In fact, I encourage them to cheat because their neighbors aren't going to have it right either. But by midterm, 75% of them have got it and can spot the main point when they see it. And I know from research on where these students go after they take my course that a lot of students really appreciate learning how to do this. You can use learning management systems to give the quiz outside of class too. That's what I'm doing this spring, and I'm actually probably going to keep that when I go back to face-to-face.
And Lendol, I think there's one last question from Crystal. How much do you find yourself lecturing, or do you lecture at all?
I do lecture. Remember the unit I showed you had 3 class meetings. The 3rd day of the unit is always a lecture. It's not straight lecture. I don't talk 50 minutes. It's lecture and discussion. But you would walk in and say he's lecturing, and that's the last unit in the last day in each unit, as I sort of guide our conversation through the 2 historians, Zinn and Laporte.
Well, I want to thank Lendol. This has been a fantastic webinar. I have learned so much, and it looks like you all have as well. I did want to remind everyone the webinar recording will be made available, and Lendol, if you are willing to share your slides with us, we'd love to post and share those as well with participants. On behalf of the Gardner Institute and our colleagues at the American Historical Association, thank you all so much. This has been tremendous, and thank you to Lendol for spending this time and sharing with us this approach that I think many of us are very excited about. So thank you.
You're welcome.